A black CEO boards a plane, just trying to fly like everyone else, but when she steps into first class, everything shifts. A gate agent questions her ticket. A flight attendant treats her like she doesn't belong, and no one realizes who she really is until it's too late. Just minutes after landing, she calls the entire crew to the front of the plane and fires 2 of them on the spot. What she says next stuns everyone and sparks a company-wide revolution that would change the airline industry forever. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Before we dive in, comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to hit subscribe, because what happens next, you'll want to see it unfold. It all started with what seemed like an ordinary flight. Amara Wilson stood quietly at the boarding gate, ticket in hand, wearing a navy blue blazer and a grace that didn't need to be announced. Around her, travelers moved with the urgency of business trips and family reunions. No one gave her a second glance, and that was exactly how she wanted it. For a woman who had spent her entire life climbing the steepest ladders in an industry built by men who didn't look like her, invisibility was a powerful tool. Today, she wasn't the CEO of Skyline Airways. Today, she was just another passenger in first class. There's something uniquely American about the idea of testing your own creation by walking through it, unseen, like a farmer tasting the fruit of his own orchard, not at the grand harvest banquet, but quietly, straight from the branch when no one is watching. That's what Amara was doing, conducting a blind audit of the very company she had rebuilt from the ground up. 5 years ago, Skyline was on the brink of collapse, a struggling regional carrier gasping for relevance. Today, it was the 5th largest airline in the country. And yet, she knew better than most that growth on paper could mask sickness in the roots. As she stepped forward to hand her boarding pass to the young gate agent, a nervous-looking man with thinning blonde hair, she could already feel it. That pause, that flicker of doubt. "Are you sure you're at the right gate, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes scanning her like a misplaced item. It wasn't anger that stirred in her chest, it was weariness. A kind of spiritual sigh that only those who've been questioned 100 times too many understand. But she smiled, with the same grace she'd used in boardrooms filled with skepticism. "Yes, I'm sure." He looked at her ticket, then her face, then, breaking protocol, asked for her ID. She noticed how the 5 passengers before her, every one of them white, had walked through unquestioned. And that's when it began. The audit she had planned in theory now had flesh and blood. It had names and tones and glances that lasted too long. Amara handed over her license, and when the agent read her name, his expression shifted, just for a second. "Amara Wilson," he repeated, uncertain. "Like the CEO?" She met his eyes and said evenly, "It's a common enough name. Now here's the truth, and I say this especially to those of you who've lived long enough to remember the weight of firsts. The first woman to own the shop on Main Street, the first black family to move into your neighborhood, the first time you felt the future arriving a little ahead of schedule. You know what it means to carry that invisible burden of proof. To have to be excellent just to be seen as equal." Amara had lived that truth her entire life. And yet, this moment, this quiet, ordinary flight wasn't about making noise. It was about seeing clearly. Because if the highest-ranking person in the company could be treated as though she didn't belong, what happened to those who had no title? No corner office? No livery? If you're hearing this and thinking, well, things like that don't happen as much anymore, I'd ask you to lean in and listen harder. They do. They just hide better now. In polite tones, in small doubts, in who gets offered a glass of water before takeoff and who doesn't, in who gets asked to prove they belong. But here's what we can all do, especially those of us who've walked a few more miles on this earth. We can choose not to look away. We can choose to recognize bias not just when it's loud and ugly, but when it's soft and familiar. We can speak up not to shout others down, but to say, we see this. We know better. We can do better. So the next time you find yourself at a gate, whether at an airport or in a conversation, ask yourself, am I welcoming someone in, or am I standing in their way? That's where change begins. And it begins with us. As Amara settled into seat 2A, the hum of first class wrapped around her like a soft lie, a polished world promising comfort and dignity, but only to some. She placed her carry-on beneath the seat, just like any passenger would, and began observing. The man beside her, a silver-haired executive type, adjusted his tie with the confidence of someone who had never been made to second-guess his place. Across the aisle, a young woman in pearls laughed as the flight attendant offered her champagne and draped her coat. Everything moved smoothly until the current reached Amara and then stopped. The flight attendant, a woman with stiff posture and a name tag that read Diane, passed her without pause, as if Amara's presence didn't register in the sequence. Amara, calm but clear, asked gently for a glass of water. Diane's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Once we're in the air," she replied, as if the request were somehow out of place. Amara watched as others received drinks, neatly folded newspapers, and warm towels. It was not the denial that stung, it was the difference. She reminded Diane she was in first class, and the attendant narrowed her gaze at the seating chart, then asked for Amara's boarding pass as if the truth needed reconfirming. "This appears to be in order," Diane said at last, with a reluctance that said everything else. The man beside Amara leaned in, his voice dipped in assumption. "First time flying first class?" She looked at him, unbothered, and replied, "No, I fly quite frequently." But he nodded with that kind of condescension polished into civility and old dance. Familiar steps. This is how bias operates when it puts on a suit and a smile. It doesn't always yell. Sometimes it simply edits someone out of the picture. It doesn't push. It withholds. And the danger is, it's easy to miss if you're not the one living it. That's why it's important for us, especially those with decades of experience behind us, to recognize the difference between manners and meaning. Many of you grew up in a time when respect was shown not by what people said, but how they acted. You know what it looks like when someone is quietly denied their due. And here's where action matters, because small behaviors shape big realities. Every time someone is overlooked, a message is sent. You don't belong here. But when we interrupt that cycle, when we question unfair treatment, when we make space rather than close it off, we become part of the solution. So the next time you see someone being treated as less than, don't wait for a title to give you permission. Let your age, your wisdom, your deep well of life experience be the authority. Speak up, step in, and remember, dignity isn't a privilege. It's a right, and it's up to all of us to protect it, especially in the quiet places where it's most often stolen. The plane rose steadily into the open blue, breaking through the clouds like a promise trying to keep itself. Amara sat in seat 2A, hands folded, gaze steady, heart measured. The injustice she'd just experienced was not loud, but it was precise, like a pinprick beneath the skin that lingers long after the needle is gone. Around her, first-class passengers clinked glasses and unfolded crisp white napkins, their smiles easy, their comfort unchallenged. Diane returned, this time with a plastic cup of water, setting it down with the careless thud of indifference. No glass tumbler, no warmth, no regard. "Here you are," she said without eye contact. Amara responded with poise, thanking her by name. "And may I also have a hot towel, like the other passengers received?" Diane's voice thinned. "We're actually out of hot towels." It was a lie. Amara had seen the extras, neatly folded, offered just moments ago to her seatmate. She looked over at the man beside her, Roger Tanner, who had just finished sipping from his tumbler of champagne. He leaned in again, that same curious tilt of head, and asked softly, "Are you really the CEO?" And in that moment, Amara smiled faintly, not from pride, but from the quiet knowledge that truth always finds a way through. "I am," he chuckled, not unkindly. "Well, they have no idea, do they?" "No," she replied, "and I'd prefer it that way, for now." There was power in watching without being watched. There was clarity in experiencing the company not from the head seat at the boardroom, but from the seat where ordinary people sit. You see, restraint is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's knowing that not every fire needs to be met with flames. That sometimes holding your tongue is not about silence, but about strategy. And those of you who've weathered a few decades know this truth better than anyone. You don't build strength by shouting. You build it by knowing exactly when to speak and exactly what your voice is worth. Amara wasn't collecting grievances, she was gathering evidence. Not for revenge, but for justice. Not to prove she belonged, but to make sure others wouldn't have to. If you ever find yourself underestimated because of your age, your skin, your background, don't rush to prove your worth to those who refuse to see it. Instead, do what Amara did. Let your presence be the proof. Let your patience be your power. And when the moment is right, speak not with anger, but with truth. Because truth, when spoken with clarity and calm, is impossible to ignore. And that, my friends, is how real change begins. The wheels touched down in San Francisco with a quiet thud, the kind that marks both an end and a beginning. Passengers unbuckled, stretched, gathered their belongings, their minds already on hotel rooms and meetings and homecomings. But for Amara, the flight wasn't over, not yet. She remained seated as first class emptied, calm and composed, her eyes carrying the weight of observation. When the cabin cleared, she rose and walked forward, not as a passenger, but as a leader reclaiming her voice. "Excuse me, Captain Reynolds," she said, reading his name from the crisp embroidery on his uniform. The pilot turned, a practiced smile ready, but it froze mid-gesture as recognition dawned. "Miss Wilson, we had no idea." "That was the point," she said evenly. "I was conducting a service audit. Please ask the crew to remain on board. We need to have a conversation." And with those few words, the air inside the aircraft shifted. No raised voice, no scene, just presence. A presence that now carried authority and accountability in equal measure. Within minutes, the flight attendants gathered in the forward galley, casual chatter fading to silence as they spotted her standing next to the captain. Amara faced them, not with fury, but with conviction. "For those who don't recognize me, I'm Amara Wilson, CEO of Skyline Airways." There was a collective inhale. Diane's face paled. Jessica's eyes fell to the floor. The others stood stiff, unsure. Then Amara spoke, not just for herself, but for every passenger who'd ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small. She recounted the events of the flight not from memory, but from documentation. A list of moments: ignored greetings, altered service, dismissive tones, unequal treatment. The truth didn't need embellishment. It stood tall on its own. Diane tried to object, her voice laced with defensiveness. "I treated you like any other passenger." But Amara didn't waver. "I didn't feel the service was lacking, I measured it. Every action, every omission. This isn't about feelings. This is about facts." The moment could have turned sharp, bitter, ugly, but instead it turned real. Jessica crumbled under the weight of her own conscience, quietly whispering an apology. And Amara, even as she suspended the two attendants, didn't lash out. She simply reminded them and all who listened that when diversity training is offered, it's not a suggestion. It's a standard, and standards matter, especially when no one's watching. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, what does this have to do with me? Let me tell you, everything. Because many of you have lived long enough to know that respect isn't just about how we treat the powerful, it's about how we treat the unseen. And when we're in a position to hold others accountable not through anger, but through clarity, we owe it to the next generation to do so. Not every injustice needs a courtroom. Sometimes it just needs a quiet reckoning, delivered in truth. So the next time you're faced with the choice to speak up or stay silent, ask yourself, what kind of world am I reinforcing with my silence? And if you can, be the person who brings the truth into the room, not to shame, but to shine a light. Because light once cast can't be ignored. Back at headquarters, just days after Flight 1523, the ripples of Amara's quiet confrontation began stirring waves throughout the company. But the storm wasn't just external, it was internal, personal, deeply human. In the silence of her apartment, Jessica sat on her couch with the weight of her actions pressing down like an uninvited guest. She wasn't watching Netflix or scrolling her phone. She was replaying each moment on that flight like a reel she couldn't turn off. The cup of water, the half-turned shoulder, the whisper she shouldn't have entertained. She picked up the phone and called the one person who had never let her off the hook. Her mother, a retired schoolteacher, the kind of woman who believed you clean your mess before the world sees it. Her voice was calm but firm. "Mom, I really messed up. Jessica said, the words trembling but true. And what her mother told her was simple and unforgettable. Water takes the shape of whatever vessel holds it. You let someone else's prejudice shape yours. That image, fluid, honest, and unshakable, hit Jessica deeper than any reprimand ever could. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Sometimes we're not the ones who light the fire, but we stand too close and say nothing when it burns someone else. And silence, too, leaves scars. Meanwhile, in a cafe across town, Diane spun her version of events to an old colleague, 23 years of service. She said, and now thrown under the bus. But the person across the table didn't bite. The old skyline barely stayed afloat, she reminded her. You say it used to be about merit, but merit wasn't always measured equally, was it? The truth hung in the air like fog, and Diane didn't have an answer. Not then. Not really. Because what was beginning to crack open at Skyline wasn't just a case of bad service, it was a mirror held up to the small, daily choices that shape workplace culture. And here's what we all know, especially those of us who've walked decades through American history. It's easy to spot injustice when it's big, loud, and brutal. But the more dangerous version, the one that lives in passing comments, unequal glances, just one bad days, is what eats at the soul of a place. If you've ever kept quiet because it felt safer, or looked away because speaking up might make things messy, let me encourage you now. The cost of silence is higher than you think. You may not have control over the voices around you, but you have absolute control over your own. Use it to reflect. Use it to question. Use it to choose better tomorrow than you did yesterday. Because reckoning isn't just for the young, it's for the wise, the seasoned, the ones who understand that real change is slow and often starts in rooms where no one's watching. So if you're carrying regret, let it become responsibility. If you're holding guilt, turn it into growth. And if you're wondering whether one voice matters, let Jessica's quiet phone call remind you it does. It always does. The days that followed moved like gears in a well-oiled clock, deliberate, humming with purpose. Amara didn't waste time licking wounds. She went to work, not with fanfare or blame, but with blueprints. Her leadership team gathered in a glass-walled conference room high above the San Francisco Bay, a place where vision met accountability. What happened on that flight, she began, wasn't just a service failure. It was a breach of values. That's the kind of sentence that doesn't just echo, it sticks. For the next 3 hours, they unspooled every thread. Hiring practices, training gaps, anonymous feedback systems, blind spots in leadership. It was like opening the walls of a house you thought was solid and finding cracks behind the paint. And yet, this wasn't collapse. This was renovation. And the work was personal. In the background, emails came pouring in from employees across departments, ground crew, baggage handlers, customer service reps, many of them saying the same thing. I've seen this too. Some stories were quiet. Some were heavy. But all of them said, now we feel safe to speak. And that's how you know something real is happening, not when the top speaks down, but when the ground begins to rise. Jessica, freshly suspended, didn't retreat into denial. She leaned in. She signed up for bias training without being told. She reached out to a youth aviation nonprofit to volunteer. She asked to join the peer education team once her probation ended, not to save face, but to fix the face she showed the world. It wasn't redemption through words, it was through work. That's the kind of growth people of your generation recognize, not the shiny apology, but the steady hand showing up day after day to make things right. Amara, too, wasn't just playing defense. She implemented a customer feedback system with specific prompts about equitable service. Within a week, the data was pouring in, and for the first time, people who'd once felt invisible were being counted. And here's what that means for you, reader. Especially if you've ever run a business, led a team, or raised a family, you know what it means to say, this house has to be strong enough for everyone. When cracks show, you don't blame the roof, you rebuild the foundation. And that's exactly what was happening. Every team member was asked not just to follow new rules, but to understand why those rules mattered. Bias training wasn't a box to check, it became a mirror. And mirrors, as you well know, don't lie. So here's a practical truth for all of us. Regardless of age, transformation isn't about catching the bad apples. It's about changing the soil they grow in. And when you see someone really try to do that, encourage it. Support it. Don't say, "It's too late." Say, "It's about time." Because as long as breath fills your lungs, there's work to do and wisdom to share. Whether you're in a boardroom or on your back porch, your voice still shapes the future. So use it. Speak up when it's easier not to. Mentor someone who reminds you of your younger self. Be the kind of elder the world needs, one who says, "I've seen better and I expect better." That's how we move forward, not just as companies, but as people, together. 2 weeks after the incident, the change was no longer confined to conference rooms or policy memos. It had begun to breathe in hallways, ripple through conversations, and settle into the quiet spaces where culture is truly shaped. Amara sat in her office, sunlight spilling across her desk like a quiet affirmation, reviewing the latest feedback numbers. The data told a new story. The gap in satisfaction between white passengers and passengers of color had narrowed for the first time in years. It wasn't a miracle and it wasn't finished, but it was movement. And movement, no matter how small, is the start of a shift. Then came the knock at her door. Roger Tanner, the businessman who'd sat beside her on that flight, now holding a check for $50,000. "For the scholarship fund," he said simply. "For the kids who never get to sit in seat 2A unless someone makes a way." That gesture mattered not because of the dollar amount, but because it came from someone who had once been a bystander and chose not to stay one. Across the country, stories like his were emerging: employees speaking up, passengers writing letters, team leads pulling new hires aside and saying, "Let me tell you what we stand for now." Even Trevor, the gate agent who'd first questioned Amara's right to be there, sent her a letter of apology. Not a form letter, but one hand-typed and honest. "I was wrong," it said, "and I'm committed to being better." That kind of vulnerability, that takes courage. And courage, especially the kind born from humility, has always been the first step toward real healing. You see, change doesn't come all at once like thunder. It arrives like morning light, quiet, persistent, undeniable. And for those of you listening who've lived long enough to watch the arc of history bend and break and bend again, you know the value of persistence. You've seen movements built not by speeches, but by steady hands doing small, consistent good. So here's your call to action. Don't underestimate the power of small course corrections. Maybe you can't rewrite a company's policy, but you can change the tone of a room. Maybe you're not in charge anymore, but your story, your memory, your voice, it still carries weight. Share the moments when you saw better, when you stood taller, when you looked someone in the eye and said, "You matter here." Remind the younger ones that dignity doesn't go out of style. And when you see someone really trying to do better, meet them with grace, not skepticism. Because progress at its best is a team sport played across generations. Skyline's transformation wasn't perfect, and it wasn't instant, but it was real, because people showed up, told the truth, and kept walking forward even when the path was hard. And if they can do that in a company of thousands, so can we in our homes, our communities, and yes, even in our own hearts. Let the shift begin with you. Let it begin now. 6 months after Flight 1523, the skyline above San Francisco shimmered with early morning light, casting a golden hue over the glass walls of Skyline Airways headquarters. Inside, an auditorium filled slowly, pilots in uniform, engineers with grease under their nails, flight attendants in crisp navy, and office staff still cradling their first cup of coffee. They had gathered not for celebration, but for commitment. On stage stood Amara Wilson, steady as ever, the same woman who once sat in seat 2A unnoticed, now commanding every eye in the room, not through title, but through truth. 6 months ago, she began. We faced a moment that asked whether our values were just words on a wall or something we were truly willing to live by. And then she unveiled it, the Inclusive Skies program. A roadmap, promise, not just training, but transformation. Not just policies, but people, mentorship for underrepresented employees, accountability at every level, and new partnerships with community organizations that would open doors for young people who never dreamed they could fly, much less fly the plane. Jessica sat in the front row, no longer suspended, no longer silent. She had completed her training, served her community hours, and now stood as the lead of Skyline's peer education team. She had failed, yes, but more importantly, she had changed. And her story stood as a living example that redemption isn't given, it's earned, through reflection and hard work. Roger Tanner was there too, now a corporate partner in Skyline's diversity initiative. And in the back stood Trevor, the gate agent once too quick to judge, now promoted to lead the Customer Experience Ambassador program, having chosen growth over guilt. These weren't characters in a redemption play. They were people, real people who chose to face their own reflection and do better. And my friend, if you've lived long enough to collect regrets like postcards from past seasons, you know that the road to redemption is paved not by what you say, but by what you do next. We've all had moments where we missed the mark. Maybe we stayed quiet when we should have spoken. Maybe we made assumptions we later learned were wrong. But the power of age is the power of perspective. And if you've been given the grace of time, then you've also been given the responsibility to make it count. So here's what I ask of you, no matter where you are, no matter how many birthdays you've seen, don't sit out this moment. Share your story. Stand for dignity. Take one action, however small, that makes another person feel seen. Because the work of building a just world doesn't retire. And neither should your voice. As the event ended, the company unveiled a new phrase beneath their logo, soon to appear on badges, training manuals, even on the sides of airplanes. Equity is excellence. For words that hold a truth older than any corporation and more enduring than any headline. A reminder that greatness is not found in what you build for yourself, but in what you build for others to stand on. And as Amara stood in her office that evening, looking at a photo of a new, diverse crew greeting her with genuine smiles, she knew something had shifted, not just in her company, but in the current of the culture itself. Not perfectly, not instantly, but undeniably. And if a flight that began in silence could land in transformation, then perhaps the same is true for us all.